Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is Jacob Jans with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. We are going to wait a couple minutes so that everybody who will be attending today can have a chance to show up. I know it takes a few minutes for everyone to arrive. If you're here, you are welcome to say hello in the chat. It's always wonderful to see where everybody is in the world and to see your names. So yeah, feel free to say hello in the chat. It's wonderful to see so many writers showing up today. We have really good attendance. So yeah, thank you everyone for being here. And we're just going to wait one more minute before we get started. I'm really excited for today's lecture. I've really been looking forward to hearing a talk from Marin for a long time. So I'm quite pleased that this is finally happening. Yeah, so thank you everyone for being here, and we are just about ready to get started. I'm going to pull up my notes. All right, just one more second. Thank you everyone again for being here, and feel free to say hello in the chat. I am going to turn the chat off during the talk, but I'll turn it back on during the Q&A session. And at the end of the talk, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A with Marin, and you can always ask your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom. All right, so let's get started. Hello, writers. This is Jacob Jans with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Marin Sardy, who will be giving a talk on the magic of metaphor. Marin will be discussing why metaphors matter, the purposes they can serve on the page, and how you can create your own metaphors that are vivid and apt. This is part of our monthly lecture series where we present talks on the craft of writing and the business of publishing. Marin Sardy is the critically acclaimed author of The Edge of Everyday, Sketches of Schizophrenia, published by Vintage, an imprint of Penguin Random House. The book was described as beautifully prismatic by NPR. It was reviewed widely and positively in publications such as the New York Times Book Review and the Wall Street Journal. She has also been published widely in literary journals, including Tin House, Guernica, and the Missouri Review. And we're also very fortunate to have Marin as an instructor here at Authors Publish. And I am very thankful that she's able to give this talk today. So without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Marin Sardy here today. Thank you for being here, Marin. Welcome. How are you?
Thank you, Jacob, for that lovely introduction. I'm doing great today. I'm really happy to be here. Welcome to all of you who are joining me in this space from, it looks like, all over the world. I'm thrilled and astounded to see just really how completely globe spanning this audience is. It's wonderful to have you here. And so let's get started talking about metaphors. All right. So metaphors, the magic of metaphor is the title of this talk today, and magic is a word that I don't use lightly. This title came to me when I was in the process of putting together this lecture and really kind of developing my own understanding of metaphor at a depth that I had not even really thought of it before. And magic just seemed like the right word to express the power that metaphors have and what they can do and how they do it, and how much force they can carry on the page. So I'm very excited to share all of this with you today. And I'll start with the basics, with what is a metaphor. Although I'm sure that all of you are pretty much already familiar with the basic formula, you probably learned it in high school, as one does, probably along with learning about what a simile is. And the basic formula for a metaphor is X is Y. And as we learned, the basic formula for a simile is X is like Y, or X is as Y. So really, there's only that one small word in there in that basic formula distinguishing between the two. But in fact, a whole lot is carried in that word or the absence of it that make metaphor and simile far more different than they are alike. But we'll start with how they're alike, which I think is beautifully summed up in this this quote by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, who I will talk about more later. And they say that the essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. And I think you could say this statement is true of similes as well. But now I want to talk about how they're different. That like does something very profound, I think. In a simile, it makes a simile come across as more playful, maybe, as less serious, as less sly than a metaphor. And additionally, it acts as sort of a verbal flag in which it's signaling to us as readers that, hey, figurative language is happening here, right? And without that like there, without that signal, you open a door for metaphor to be able to do much, much more that is deeper, much more that is subtler and less obvious. So let's start by taking a look at this example quote by William Shakespeare from his play, As You Like It. It's perhaps one of the most famous metaphors in the English language. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. So let's take a moment to think about how this would read differently if Shakespeare had constructed it not as a metaphor, but as a simile. All the world's like a stage, and the men and women are like actors. You can see that it lacks a certain gravity when you say it that way. It lacks a certain weight that happens when you say that X is Y. All the world is a stage, and men and women are actors. When you have that happening, you're going beyond just suggesting parallels between two things, and you're actually equating them with one another. And of course, we understand metaphor well enough to know not to take that equation too seriously, but nonetheless, it still has a power to give us that sense of the importance of making that equation. For instance, when I read this quote, I always have certain things that come to mind. It draws to mind serious things about how we all have roles that we're expected to play in life, and that society places expectations on us, and that we step into those roles, and that on some level we're always performing ourselves. So it's pointing to these much deeper forces that are quite profound about how humanity operates, and that in a sense we can't not be performing the roles that we're given. So this, I think, starts to really get at the magic of metaphor here. It can do so much with so little. And so I want to look deeper at how it does that. But first, I want to start by looking at some different kinds of metaphors. There are, in fact, many different kinds of metaphors, as I discovered when I was researching this. But I've identified just a few that I think are the most common and the most important, and maybe the most helpful to think about for creative writing. I can start with what we call a basic metaphor, and that is just a metaphor in its simplest package of that X and Y formula. So here in the Shakespeare quote, the basic metaphor would be all the world's a stage, just the X is Y. And in fact, he has expanded on that a little bit by adding a little more detail to clarify and further illuminate what he means by that. So in fact, this is what we would call a compound metaphor. On this next slide, here are a couple more examples of compound metaphors that are working by adding a little more detail that says and illuminates a little bit more about that fundamental X is Y equation. So the first one here by E.M. Forster says, "Life," wrote a friend of mine, "is a public performance on the violin in which you must learn the instrument as you go along." So we can see here that the X in this statement is life, and the Y being a performance. But he's added some more detail here, the public performance, and it's on the violin. And then he goes on to do something a little different. He says, in which you must learn the instrument as you go along. So now suddenly you are being asked to step into the environment of the metaphorical image. And now there's some action, and it's suddenly more dynamic because you've climbed inside it and you're doing something in there. So that really contributes to the vividness and the dynamism of this quote. If we look at the next example, also a compound metaphor, she does something a little bit different. This is from Angela Carter's story, The Lady in the House of Love. It says, "She herself is a haunted house. She does not possess herself. Her ancestors sometimes come and peer out of the windows of her eyes, and that is very frightening." So again, the basic X is Y formula. She is a haunted house. And then we get some more detail elaborating on that. And then Carter does something else here. She breaks it down into its component parts and compares those to each other. From the house, she focuses on the window. And from the person, she focuses on the eyes. And then she compares this piece of the house, the window, to this piece of the person, the eyes. So you're starting again to see it in much greater detail. And this further illuminates how the woman is like the house. So these are compound metaphors. There's a little bit more going on, but they're still pretty short, 1 sentence, 2 sentences. When we further expand on that, that's when we get into what are called extended metaphors. And extended metaphors can be quite long, anywhere from like a paragraph to an entire book. And I'll come back to that later. This example is from Langston Hughes's poem, Mother to Son, in which the entire poem is a single extended metaphor. And I've just taken an excerpt here from the poem to show you what Hughes is doing. And in fact, you can see that in this extended metaphor, he does both of the things that we saw the previous writers do. Life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time, I's have been climbing on and reaching landings and turning corners and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So in the first half of this excerpt, we see Hughes elaborating on the metaphor of the stairway by providing really rich sensory detail that speaks to what kind of stairway he is saying. He is equating with life, with the life of the speaker, the mother who's talking to her son. And then in the second half, we see action happening. We see this speaker, again, stepping into the world, the environment of the image of the metaphor, and moving around in there. And those movements that she's doing within that stairway become part of the metaphor of the stairway, the climbing, the reaching landings, the turning corners. So he's done both of those things there. And again, it really adds to the richness of the experience and to the clarity of what he's trying to use this metaphor to say. So I also want to point out that in this extended metaphor, he's still relied on that basic X is Y formula as the starting point. Life is the stairway. And from there, he goes on to expand. But that's not always an absolute requirement. And there's a certain category of extended metaphor that when it fulfills an entire narrative, when you construct an entire narrative out of the metaphor, that's called an allegory. And we're quite familiar with allegories, for instance, from like Greek mythology. Many myths are allegories in which the entire story is symbolic. For instance, the Greek myths are not actually about newsflash, nymphs, dryads, and centaurs. They are, in fact, about human life. But what you might notice there is that the X is Y statement is missing. It's been removed. If you read a Greek myth, it never overtly tells you what the symbolism in the story is intended to represent on a literal human level. So you, as the reader, are left to interpret it and to try to figure out on your own and come to understand on your own what it's meant to represent. And that's what we call implied metaphor. And in fact, implied metaphors are everywhere. They are metaphors in which that opening X is Y statement is just left out. And it is left to us, based on the language of the metaphor that is being used, to understand what X is Y equation is being pointed back to. So let's talk a little bit more about implied metaphors. As I said, implied metaphors are everywhere. They're a fundamental part of our colloquial language. They're in our idioms all the time. And here are just a few examples of that. Don't tuck your tail and run away. This isn't how I want to spend my time. That flat tire cost me an hour. So if we look at that first one, we see the language tucking your tail and running away. So what is the X is Y equation that is being pointed back to there? Something like, you are a frightened dog. Okay. We know we never come out and say you are a frightened dog, but we suggest it, we imply it. Okay. And so that's what that metaphor is doing. And then the two below it, if we look at those, using the verb spend and the verb cost in relation to time, that implies a very well-known X is Y metaphor formula, which is time is money, right? And putting forth the concept that time is a resource that can be spent and used and wasted just in the same way as any other resources. And that brings me to this last one. These are also implied metaphors, but it's sort of a specific subset called the conceptual metaphor. And these are profoundly fundamental to how we build language. For instance, these examples, things are looking up and I've been feeling down. Everything fell apart. These are in fact conceptual metaphors that are called orientational metaphors, or in the bottom one is the spatial metaphor. These are metaphors that take abstract concepts that are integral to daily life and translate them into something concrete so that we can envision them in a concrete way. Things are looking up. I've been feeling down. Those are emotions, happiness and sadness. And in these metaphors, they're being equated with directions, up and down. Or everything fell apart. That's equating success with wholeness, unity, cohesion. And there are a number of idioms that we commonly use that also relate to that basic idea of success as wholeness. So these are important because they really get at the heart of what metaphors do, that I think is really so much of their magic, of translating the abstract to the concrete. And that brings me to this question of why are metaphors useful? And for this, I want to point back to that quote that I showed you before. I'm sorry. Here you go. That quote that I showed you before by Lakoff and Johnson, in which they said that metaphors enable us to understand and experience one kind of thing in terms of another. If you think of those conceptual metaphors, they're enabling us to understand an abstract concept by experiencing it as something concrete, to understand an emotion by experiencing it as a direction. And that's quite profound. And in fact, Lakoff and Johnson, they are two linguists and philosophers who wrote a seminal book in 1980 that I pulled that quote from, which was titled Metaphors We Live By. And in that book, Lakoff and Johnson argued that although we tend to think of metaphors as decoration, as linguistic wordplay, as a clever way to use language and to make it pretty and make it poetic, they are in fact much deeper and bigger and more important than that, as we've seen from those conceptual metaphors that I showed you. Lakoff and Johnson argued that metaphors give structure to concepts that would be otherwise too amorphous and too intangible for us to clearly envision and to easily grasp. So they make it possible for us to understand things that are difficult to envision. And they do this by enabling us to experience those things on a sensory level. They render things without form as things that are visible, tangible, and experiential, things that we can apprehend with our five senses. So this is magic, I think. I think this is amazing. And in doing so, they shape how we think. So let's think about that for a second. If we go back to that time is money metaphor, many people just think of it as sort of self-evident that time is like money, that time is a resource. This is something maybe we never even question. But when you think about it, this is not historically the only way that people have conceived of time. And in fact, this wasn't even a prominent way of conceiving of time until we got closer to the modern era and capitalism became our primary economic system. Now we live in a capitalist society that highly values productivity. And in that kind of society, it is very useful to think of time as a resource, to think in terms of measuring time and allotting time as we would any other resource. But many cultures have not historically conceived of time in this way. And you're probably familiar with some of these alternative conceptions. For instance, traditional cultures often thought of time as like a wheel or like a river. And to those people in those societies, the idea of time as a resource would likely have felt quite foreign. So this is a good example of how the metaphor has the power to shape how we think about things. Okay. So that's all very interesting. That's all very smart, very deep. That's great. But what does it mean for me when I want to sit down to the page as a creative writer and actually use this in my writing? Well, as creative writers, we're often trying to communicate a lot of abstract truths, right? We're dealing with complex concepts that relate to emotions, identity, social life, culture, spirituality, personal development. And we're trying to do that in ways that feel fresh, that feel engaging, and that feel dynamic for readers. And so metaphors are a powerful tool that we can use to do so, because metaphors enable us to not just tell people about these concepts, but to show them in ways that feel full-bodied. Metaphors enable readers to climb inside the text and experience it with us. And they help readers to fully immerse themselves in what we're writing on a sensory level. And so they very much deepen and enrich the reading experience. Metaphors also have the power to take something familiar and illuminate it in a way that is unfamiliar. And when that happens, it's surprising, and it gives us the ability to see things again as if for the first time, to look on them with new eyes. And lastly, metaphors are useful because they leave room for the unknown. They're not speaking in absolutes. When you use imagery, you can suggest things, you can speak about them indirectly. And when you use metaphors to talk about things, you leave open space for ambiguity, for the possibility of multiple interpretations. And this provides yet another opportunity for readers to bring themselves into the text. And to make their own discoveries about the text and within the text and find their own meanings in it. So this is all very valuable stuff for a creative writer to be able to harness. So then what makes a good metaphor? Well, I've identified what I think are four main elements of a metaphor that are important to make a metaphor very strong on the page. And those are clear imagery, aptness, originality, and authenticity. So let's use our example here that I've placed on this page to consider each of these in turn. The quote is from William Golding's famous novel, Lord of the Flies, in which he says, "The sun in the west was a drop of burning gold that slid near and nearer the sill of the world." Okay. So let's look first at clear imagery. If so much of the power of metaphor lies in what it evokes on a sensory level, then it's important to make it easy for readers to engage their senses. And so the image does need to be clear. And it needs to be easy for the reader to feel those sensations and to not require the reader to get in there and try to figure it out in order to experience it, right? And if we look at this quote, it is very clear. The sun in the west was a drop of burning gold. So that's that image, there's this liquid, there's this glowing, there's this color, and it slid near and nearer the sill of the world. So we see it going down slowly, and the sill, that edge of the world, the horizon there, we see that immediately, very clear. The next one is aptness. A metaphor needs to be the right fit for what you're trying to say. And this is true on two levels. It's true on the level of logic. If you're writing about something literal, you want the metaphor to actually make sense as a representation of it. So for instance, if you're writing about a person whose personality is very soft and gentle, you might not want to choose a bee as the metaphor, because the first thing people are going to think about when they hear bee is the sting. So it doesn't bring up the image that's going to represent what you're trying to say. But aptness is also really important on a subtler level, an emotional level of mood and vibe. And if you look at this quote, I think it's really masterful use of that kind of emotional aptness. If we recall, The Lord of the Flies is a story about a group of young boys who are alone on an island without any adults around, and it quickly devolves from a place of civilized order to brutal chaos as civilization sort of slips away from them. And in this quote, you have this liquid, glowing, burning, sliding, right? That's happening towards the sill of the world here, this threshold, this sort of point of no return. And all of the things, all the associations that come up with that are perfectly suited for what the story is talking about on an emotional level. So that's aptness too, and it's important to keep in mind. The third point of what makes a good metaphor is originality. Original metaphors tend to be much more effective than metaphors that you've heard before, because fresh metaphors surprise us. They delight us. They get our attention, and they're memorable. And part of why they delight us is because they shake us out of our old ways of thinking about things. And so they can make us feel or experience or understand something completely new. And so all of that makes an original metaphor so much stronger than one that has been heard many times before. And certainly this metaphor is highly original, I think. And I particularly like to point to that word sill, the sill of the world, because of course, we're all familiar with the phrase, the edge of the world. That's one that people use all the time. He's talking about the horizon here, but instead of saying the edge of the world, he found a different word, a word that instead of just kind of conjuring a non-image, conjures a very rich and specific and interesting image, almost like you're looking out a window from the place of inside a house, maybe inside of civilization, out onto this wilderness, this place that these boys are traveling into. So again, there's the aptness there, but also that originality invites us to do more work there as readers, invites us to engage in it a little bit more than we would if it wasn't so brand new to us. So that's important. And then the last point about good metaphors is authenticity. And this certainly is connected to originality, but it's more the idea that a strong metaphor should feel like it has emerged naturally out of the context that it is in, that it came out of the words and the images that surround it. It should feel organic to the experience, organic to the moment. So remember that when you're producing metaphors, you don't need to shift your tone. You don't need to start using a different kind of language, a different kind of voice, and you don't need to pull from a specific set of metaphorical imagery. In fact, it's going to be stronger if the images and the language feel very much of a piece with the text as a whole. And, going back to this quote, as I've talked about, much of what makes it so apt is that it does feel so of a piece with the story that it's telling. And you can tell, of course, much of the language is pulled directly. This is an image in the environment, in the boy's environment of the story that is being used as a metaphor here. All right, so that's what makes a good metaphor. What about bad metaphors? And that brings us to common metaphor pitfalls. What you want to avoid when you're writing metaphors and why. So I'll start with the number one most common metaphor pitfall, which is cliche metaphors. And here are a few examples. That is music to my ears. She finally kicked the bucket. We're mending fences and building bridges. So our daily, ordinary speaking language is full of these colloquialism. It's full of these sort of colorful phrases that we throw in. And I think that's great for everyday spoken language. It adds a little bit of an element of fun and imagery and color to how we talk. But they just don't work nearly as well on the page. And there's a few reasons for that. And I'll start with the basic definition of a cliche, which gets at one of the primary reasons. A cliche is defined as a phrase or opinion that is overused and betrays a lack of original thought. So, number one, you should avoid cliches because they're not your words and they're not your ideas. They betray a lack of original thought. When you rely on a cliche, you're borrowing from someone else's vision of the world rather than expressing your own. And as creative writers, we want to be expressing our own vision of the world. And number two, which is not unconnected to that, they're boring. Cliches are far less interesting than original metaphors because we've heard them so many times before. And as such, they yield nothing new. No new imagery, no new ideas. And that brings me to number three. Because cliches are so commonly used, they are also essentially powerless. The fact that they've been heard so many times drains them of so much of their strength. And in fact, if you look at these three examples, you can see that, in fact, all of them, through overuse, have been completely separated from the actual image that they're based on. When you say she kicked the bucket, you don't picture a person kicking a bucket. When you hear we're mending fences, you don't picture a guy repairing a hole in his chain link fence. These phrases become units of meaning themselves, and they stand in for words. And we just take them for what we know they mean, rather than actually conjuring the image. And when a metaphor becomes to that point that it is utterly separated from the image that it was intended to conjure, it's actually called a dead metaphor, because the image is lost. And if so much of the power of metaphors has to do with the way they enable us to experience things on a sensory level, then losing that conjuring of the image is profoundly weakening. So that brings me to mixed metaphors. And the problem with mixed metaphors also has to do with the failure to conjure an effective image. A mixed metaphor, in brief, is a metaphor that relies on two or more images that don't logically work together, so that you end up with something that doesn't make sense. For instance, these two examples here. To make any progress, we'll have to iron out the bottlenecks. And the alligators were in the swamp and it was time to circle the wagons. So in that first one, if you actually try to picture that, I see sort of a person standing at an ironing board going over a beer bottle, with the iron, trying to flatten it out, which is ridiculous. And similarly ridiculous is this idea of the wagon circling. You picture a prairie, of course, and they're all there, and coming across the plains is what, a herd of alligators? You know what I mean? So it's funny, it's ridiculous, but what happens is that instead of these images supporting one another in creating an image, they confound each other and they deflate one another, and they create an imagistic mishmash that makes it impossible for the metaphor to show the thing that it's trying to say. And so again, you lose that sensory experiential quality that's so important. My next metaphor pitfall is also quite similar in its effect, and that's called the stacked metaphor. A stacked metaphor is like a mixed metaphor, except instead of there being two competing images within a metaphor, it's a piling up of multiple metaphors so close together that, again, as with the mixed metaphor, they start to compete with each other and create a mishmash. So this example I want to point to is from Billy Collins. It's an excerpt from his poem Litany. I want to be clear that this is a humorous poem in which he is making fun of the use of stacked metaphors. He knows that he is stacking metaphors and he's doing it for humorous effect. And to anyone who finds that appealing, I definitely recommend that you go Google this poem and read the whole thing in its entirety, because it is quite funny. This is just one stanza that I'll read aloud. You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine. You are the dew on the morning grass and the burning wheel of the sun. You are the white apron of the baker and the marsh birds suddenly in flight. So here again, you see that each of these images, instead of further illuminating the other images, is just a hodgepodge of sensations. First we start out the bread and the knife, the goblet and the wine. Okay, we're at a dining room, we're at a table, and then suddenly we're outside on the lawn looking at the dew on the grass, and then we're looking up at the sky and there's the sun, and then we're back inside in the kitchen with the baker, and then we're outside again in a marsh this time, right? So we're all over the place. And what happens is when you take all of these images together, you see that they don't express anything in particular at all. Like, we finish this stanza having absolutely no idea what the takeaway is about what this stuff is supposed to say about the you in the poem. So as with the mixed metaphors, instead of enabling us to see it more clearly, it just overwhelms us with imagery, and we lose that sensory experiential quality. And then the final kind of metaphor pitfall that I want to talk about is the forced metaphor. And this one is, I think, probably the least common problem, but I also think it's important to mention because it gets at something very important to recognize about metaphors. A forced metaphor would be a metaphor that's not quite just the right fit. It's not quite apt enough in some way. And you try to use it anyway and try to kind of force it in there and make it work, even though it's just a little off. That can happen, especially when we're working with extended metaphors. Maybe a metaphor is perfect for one aspect of the X that it's referring back to, but then the similarities end and it stops being quite so perfect. There's always a point in a metaphor where the comparison reaches its limit, where X and Y diverge and the parallels between them end. Because they're not identical. Despite that X is Y construction, it's important to remember that the metaphor is not the thing itself. They are not identical. And when a metaphor reaches the limit of its usefulness, it's important to try not to force it, to not try to force it, because that will feel awkward, it will feel confusing, and it will feel like you're trying too hard. It's better to just let it go and be patient and search for one that feels like a more natural fit. So with all of this in mind, how do we as creative writers go forward with finding our own metaphors? So here are a few tips that I've put together that I think can help you as you delve into producing metaphors, particularly if you're new to this. I think the first one is especially helpful if you're new to this, and that is reach past what comes to mind first. Or to phrase that in terms of a dead metaphor, reach past the low-hanging fruit, because the low-hanging fruit will almost always be cliches. Generally, when we're thinking about things like this and we're coming up with a comparison, the things that come into our mind first are the cliches, are the ones that we've heard, the ones that we use in everyday speech, right? So you can get in the habit of just automatically rejecting those first couple of things that come through, and give it a little more time and be a little more patient, and strive a little further to find something that's going to be a little more original, more authentic, and more apt. And if you stay with it, your brain does have better ideas lurking back in those dark corners, and often they just need a little bit of space cleared for them to come to the surface. So, look deeper, be patient. And if you'll find that if you sit with it, then more vivid and more original ideas will come up. Number two, don't look to others. So this goes back to what I was saying about cliches. Separate your experience from other people's experience. If you're writing about something, you can ask yourself, what makes this experience uniquely mine? Just because someone else's love is a red, red rose does not mean that my love is a red, red rose. Okay. And you can ask yourself, what is my love actually like? And what do I want to say about it? That is uniquely mine. That is my idea. That are my words, right? For instance, when I wrote my memoir, The Edge of Every Day, much of the book was set in Alaska, where I come from. And I wanted to draw some metaphors from Alaska. But I knew that Alaska is a very famous place, and there are a lot of stereotypes about Alaska that are put forth by the tourism industry, that are things that people are likely to think of first when they think of Alaska. So one thing I did was to ask myself, what would readers expect to read about Alaska? And what do I know about Alaska that is not what they expect? And how can I pull my images that are fresh, that are going to be new to them? Images that feel original and striking to them by not being what they already know about Alaska. Okay, and that very strongly connects to point 3, which is draw from your story's literal environment, the environment of the piece that you're writing. And certainly this is particularly useful in creative nonfiction, which is what I write, but I think that it can be valuable in different ways for all genres. But your character or your speaker of your poem or your younger self is inhabiting a space. What in that space can speak to what you're trying to express? And when you do that, it gives you the opportunity to find things that you're deeply familiar with already, things that you know very well in that tangible sensory way. And so you have more at your disposal. That familiarity means that you can access all kinds of detail and all kinds of unexpected things that can give your metaphor that richness, that multisensory experiential quality, because you know so much about the things that you're pulling your metaphor from. And certainly also this goes back to that idea of aptness and of the metaphor feeling like it emerged naturally from its context. This helps with that as well. And then that brings me to my final suggestion, which is mine your memories. And this is a way to find metaphors from that environment of the things that you're writing about. It relies on something that I think our brains do automatically and unconsciously, which makes it, I think, both incredibly powerful and remarkably easy. And that is that when you conjure a memory of a place or of an event or whatever it is that you want to be writing about, there will be certain details that naturally come to the surface and sort of ask for your attention. Memories carry within them a lot of emotional information, and that emotional information is usually embedded in the details, so that things that catch your attention first tend to be meaningful on some sort of deeper level. And in addition to that, as memories degrade, a lot of the less relevant details vanish, right? And over time, what remains and the elements within a memory that we remember best are the ones that have the most symbolic import. So we can harness that. And I definitely recommend doing this as a writing exercise if you're interested in that. Writing down memories, because certainly as we write things down, it also pulls out details that maybe wouldn't even come to mind if we were just thinking of it. But you can let your unconscious mind do that work for you. And you can trust that process and know that things will rise up and sort of present them to you on their own as possible metaphors. That I think is part of the joy of the discovery of creative writing. So keep that in mind. So that's it for my thoughts about metaphors, the magic of metaphors, and where to find it and how to use it. I hope you've enjoyed thinking about this with me today. I hope that what I've offered you gives you the tools that you need to create, powerful metaphors that are beautiful and vivid and unexpected and dynamic. So thanks for sharing this time with me. And now I think we'll have a Q&A.
Thank you, Marin, so much. My mind feels like I'm just ready to start writing metaphors.
Fantastic.
Which is kind of exciting. So it seems to me that, well, first of all, for those of you who are still here, I'm going to be looking at the Q&A. We have far more questions in the Q&A than we have time for, but I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. One of the questions that I thought about when as you were going through your lecture was the ambiguity of metaphors makes them dangerous in a way. In my head, I was starting to come up with a metaphor for our audience, and I immediately thought, if I did that during this presentation, I'm running the risk of that ambiguity really offending people. And I know that you have, as someone who does creative nonfiction, you write about real people sometimes. Is that something you think about?
It is in fact something that has come up only once for me, but it didn't involve people, but in fact it involved animals.
Oh.
In my book, I rely on encounters with animals that I had as a young person as a way to speak to my own emotional state and a way to speak to, my book is about the mental illness that runs in my family. My mother had it, my brother had it, and that affected me profoundly, particularly, as a child of a mother who was dealing with that. And so I used animals in dangerous and damaging situations to speak to my own emotional state. And I didn't think much about it. But I was using them metaphorically. But I did have one reader leave a comment once about how horrible I was in thinking of animals in this way. And she seemed to she just missed that I was using them to describe myself. She thought I was describing in a way that was very heartless and uncaring, when in fact, the intention was to make readers feel something profoundly sympathetic and poignant. And so that does happen. And I mean, all I could do about that, obviously, that's not a very serious incident. So I just sort of shrugged it off. But absolutely, anytime there's that ambiguity, there's that possibility.
As you're going through the writing process, how much do you think about the possible interpretations of your metaphors?
I think in the drafting, I tend to not think about it much. I think I tend to really try to tap into that unconscious thing as much as I possibly can, of just like opening that gate and to try to let something come in. And then if I sense it coming in, really try to run with it, be conscious enough to know, oh, I see what's happening here. I can wield this, right? And I think it's then in later drafts, in the revision, that I really bring that analytical mind to it and start asking myself, is this really apt? Is this really saying what it needs to say and saying it in the right way? And then I can tweak the language, or, and is it original enough? And I can start doing that fine tuning to make it just right.
We have a question from Diane. How do you recognize when you've written a cheesy or over dramatic metaphor that sounds like purple prose?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that there's a couple things. I think one thing is just experience. I think that when you're writing metaphors, when you're working with metaphors, the more you do it, the more you sort of develop an awareness of the different kinds of things that can go wrong with them. And so you just start maybe kind of keeping an eye out for that kind of thing. Also, I'm a big believer in setting things aside for a while and coming back to them later. Certainly, like when you're drafting something that's very emotional, you want to be letting those emotions out, right? You want to be using them and writing them. And then later, when I'm maybe in a little more sober place, I can come back to it and be like, I think that's maybe a bit much, So, yeah.
Yeah, I think space from that, because when you're drafting, I feel like if you're analytical, you can't get to the places you need to get. So yeah, separating that out makes sense.
Can shut it down. Yeah. And you don't want that. Yeah.
We have another question from Eric, and he asks, is there such a thing as too many metaphors in fiction or prose in general?
Well, I think that goes back to that question, that sort of fundamental thing that I brought up when talking about the mixed metaphors and the stacked metaphors of when they start to compete with one another rather than supporting one another. And so I think, the answer in short would be yes, but it depends, right? I think it's a case by case thing that you got to look at and ask yourself, are these metaphors undercutting each other? Are they too close together? Are there too many in too small of a space? What's the reader's experience with this? And that's also the kind of thing that you can rely on readers. That's one of the reasons, writers show our work to other people and get their feedback, because they can let you know if, this is too much here. Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions in terms of just practicing the writing of metaphors or exercises to get better at writing metaphors?
Well, I'm a nonfiction writer and I teach creative nonfiction. So most of my exercises that relate to metaphor in some way have to do with that mining your memories thing.
Yeah.
And so in terms of that, I would say, if there is a real life experience that whatever you're writing is based on, if you're not writing nonfiction, go deep into that real life experience. And I would say the writing exercises of if you have a memory in mind, just write about it for 10 minutes in as much detail as you possibly can. And then see what comes out on the page, see if there are any images that, reading it afterwards are announcing themselves. And that's, I think, a main one, definitely.
Yeah. I think that's interesting that what you just said about writing the imagery and then you go back and then see what could be a metaphor or maybe already is a metaphor without realizing it.
Yeah. I mean, I do think in my personal experience, my best metaphors are always ones that as they were appearing on the page, I was like, oh, wow, look at that. Look at what came out there. That works. I don't know beforehand what's, yeah.
Yeah. So you don't sit down and think, okay, I'm going to add a metaphor in this section.
Right. I don't do that. It's more, I think, and I talk about this too when I teach nonfiction, this idea of immersing yourself in the experience of the moment, a memory in nonfiction, but not always. Climb down inside it, surround yourself with it, and then it's all right there. And then if you're writing from that place of being, fully inside it, then things can just come to the surface so easily.
I think that's interesting that you described that via metaphor. That
Yeah, an
going
orientational metaphor,
down.
right? Climb down inside it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's almost like metaphors come from putting yourself inside the place of a metaphor. And maybe that's a little abstract, but I seem to understand how that could work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really well put, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting. Let me look up another question. So another question I have, when you're revising, how deeply do you think through the metaphor? At what point do you know when to stop thinking about what the metaphor could mean?
That's a good question. I think for me, that analytical part for me feels a lot like fact checking. Like it's absolutely necessary. You got to take the time to do it. But I don't think I spend a lot of time. It's more like checking. Does this really work? Am I sure this works? Does this work in this way? Does this work in this way? Yes. Okay. That's it. The other part of revising, though, that I also think is really important for metaphors is what I was talking about, like that emotional aptness, the mood and the vibe. And a lot of what I do when I revise is I put myself in a space where I'm feeling the world that is being conjured by this text, right? And so I have this sort of sensory apparatus at work that is going to, sort of ping if something feels off, right? And so I'm waiting for something to feel wrong. And if it just keeps feeling right, then I just keep going.
It seems to me that what you want for the experience of the reader is to be in that place. And so like that, you're almost talking about imagining the reader in that place as well. And like, they're going to be doing, like, I know as a reader, I'm always looking for those pings that might be like, oh, this doesn't fit. And then you have to leave the place the book took you to.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, when I revise, I think I try to step into the role of the reader and try to experience it as a reader would, right? And try to predict everything that the reader is going to, have in response to it, and to see if I myself feel the way I want the reader to feel, right? And if I myself grasp it the way I want the reader to. And of course, that's not a perfect system. Again, this is why you give your stuff to other people to read so that they can do that. Yeah,
I find it, as someone I've been studying publishing for so long now, like I continually have realized how important that is, that community of other writers and the feedback. If you look at most books these days, the acknowledgement section makes it clear that it takes a real community to put out a book.
That's really true. Yeah, absolutely. And I say that to my students over and over. The benefits, not just in terms of just the camaraderie, the support, the friendship, but also the eyes on your pages. It's invaluable.
We're just about out of time. Is there anything else you would like to say to everyone listening today?
Just to reiterate that I'm so thrilled and astounded that this audience is truly global. And I'm so grateful for you all to have come here to share this time with me today. Thank you.
I want to thank you, Marin, for being here today and for your time. And I want to thank everybody who was here today for sharing your time with us. I would also like to thank everybody at Authors Publish who makes these possible, Caitlin Jans, especially, who is our editor-in-chief. For those of you who have any questions for me, you can always email me at support@authorspublish.com. And I also encourage you to buy Marin's book, The Edge of Every Day. And thank you again for being here. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, Marin.